Peace of Christ, dear friends. I trust that you and your families and your loved ones are doing well and keeping safe. Today on Faith-Filled Fridays, I'd like to study with you Psalms 120. It's one of my favorite Psalms. You know, Psalms 20 forms a part of the compilation of what we call the Songs of Ascent. Songs of Ascent are a compilation of songs or psalms in the book of Psalms, and they go from 120 to 134. In fact, if you've heard the beautiful Hillsong United Song of Ascent, you kind of get like a vivid picture. The beauty of these psalms are revealed in that song. And the reason they're called Songs of Ascent is because we're invited to ascend. We're invited to a journey. So it's a movement, and that is what the Israelites are doing here. They are embarking on a journey. They are embarking and they are ascending upwards. They're moving upwards from where they are to where they must be. They are moving upwards to Jerusalem. And this is very significant for us because when you see the geographical narrative, for example, of the place, you know, as much as they traverse through the deserts, whether it's Dan or Beersheba or Gilead, ultimately, one could only go to Jerusalem when they went uphill, because Jerusalem was at the top of the hill. Nobody went downward to Jerusalem. Everybody went upward to Jerusalem. And that's a great picture, as you know, of the intimacy of God, because as you know, in the Old Testament, God was always pictured to be found on a mountain. That is where he invited his chosen people to come and meet with him face to face, as one does with a friend on a mountain. And so the mountain is a great picture of the intimacy and friendship of God. And so here we see the Israelites moving upward to Jerusalem. Now, why did they set out on this journey? And what is this journey all about? Well, first and foremost, we need to understand that in the Old Testament, you know, the Israelites were marked with covenant love, as you know. So God made a covenant with them. And in this covenant, God revealed himself to them. He revealed himself as their redeemer, as their protector, as their defender, as their God, as their father. But he also revealed who they were. They were a holy nation, a people of priceless possession. They were a people anointed, set apart for God. And so every year what they would do is they would rally to the mountain. As you know, rally is a gathering of people, and they would rally 3 times a year. The first time they would rally was for the Feast of Passover. Then was the Feast of Pentecost, or we know it was also as the first fruit offering. And then there was a Feast of the Tabernacles. In each of these feasts, the people of Israel would rally to the mountain. They would embark, they would ascend. They were, in a sense, going on their own spiritual pilgrimage. And what were they doing there? What was the essence of this pilgrimage? Well, first and foremost, it was a time of celebration. They were celebrating covenant law. They were celebrating covenant love. They were celebrating the faithfulness of God. They were celebrating the goodness of God. They were there to honor God with their sacrifice and devotion. But at many deeper levels, as you ascend, they were also going from something into something. So they were going from their sinful ways, from the places where they had moved away from God, into the heart of God. And so every Israelite knew that, and as they embarked on this journey, they were going from something ordinary to something extraordinary, to something supernatural. They were going from the chaos of life to the stillness of their soul. In so many ways, they were going from a level of comfort and convenience to a place of courage. They were going from a place of self-interest to a place of humility. They were going from a place of self-defense to a place of trust. And so these journeys, as much as they were geographical, it was so much more than that. This spiritual pilgrimage, this journey, was a journey that was inward. It was a time of repentance. It was a time of God's mercy and forgiveness. It was an inward journey of the heart, where the people of God went from one level of the heart to the next level, to the next level, until they found at the depths. That is where God waits for us. In the deep, God desires to meet with us. You know, there's one title that I can give this psalm. I'd like to call it Going Home. Because immediately the presence of God is home, right? We say the presence of God is where we feel most at home. It's a place where we are seen, known, and loved. at every level of our human complexity. Going home also means that I'm not where I'm supposed to be. Back in college, I remember when I was a boarder, we used to love the weekends in the beginning, of course, because we loved to go home to visit with our parents and our families. And so weekends was a time we would just wait. And I remember as a young boarder, like when I entered first, and I was new, and in fact I entered late because I was a month late actually. There were some issues with my application. So when I came in, I felt like a complete misfit. I was a stranger because everybody there in the boarding had already made friends. They already had their squads, and I was the one left out. And so I had walked into what I call, introverts hell on earth, because you walk in and you're desperately look for someone to find a seat at the table. You're desperate to see someone that you know. This feeling of estrangement, this feeling of being a misfit or being misplaced is felt by all of us at some point in our life. When we are abandoned, when we are rejected, when we are not included, when we are down prioritized, when we are marginalized. All of us feel a sense of estrangement, but we also inherently deep inside, intuitively have a longing for home. Because in our heads and in our hearts, we know home is a place where we are fully received. Home is a place where we are valued for our voice and our presence. We don't have to pretend. We don't have to get it all together. We can be who we are. Home is a place where we are seen, known, and loved at every angle of our being. But as much as I say that, this feeling of estrangement is not just restricted to us not being included. This feeling of being misfit, this feeling of being misplaced, this feeling of estrangement is also felt when we walk away from God, when we sin, when we move off track from the heart of God. Like those sheep that constantly look for alternate pastures, we lose sight and track of the shepherd before us. And before we know it, we are off track from our journey. I don't know about you, but so many times in my life, I've just come to a point where I've said, how did I get here? I was supposed to be there. How did I get here? So if you are that person today, maybe you had a journey and you had begun well, but today you know you're not in the right place. You know you have moved away from the heart of God, or you've moved off course from the path that God has for you. Take heart, because today is a great day to team up with the psalmist and embark on this journey upward to Jerusalem, where God is calling us home. So what I'd like to do, my dear friends, is I'd like to navigate this psalm through 3 R words. So what we do is at every position we'll try to pitch 3 R words, and we try to chew them a little bit, and we try to soak and go deeper into the psalm. So the first word I'd like to give you is the word remembrance. And so if you go to Psalms 120, it says here in verse 1, I call on the Lord in my distress, and he answers me. And he answers me. Who does the psalmist remember when he is in distress? Who does the psalmist remember when he recognizes that he is not where he is meant to be? He remembers the Lord. Remembrance immediately positions us back into the journey. The goodness, the faithfulness of God immediately brings us back onto that path. You see, remembrance does so many things to us. One of the first things that it teaches us is that the journey to the heart of God begins with God himself. It's his grace that beckons us to come to him. It is his grace by which we are enabled to recognize that we are not where we are meant to be. So moving on, verse 2, we see there's a problem. The psalmist cries out, "Save me, O Lord, from lying lips and from deceitful tongues." Now we immediately know when we read this that someone has offended him. Somebody that he trusted, somebody that he cared for has betrayed him. And so at the same time, even though he's hurt, he also recognizes that he's put trust in mortal man rather than his God. Moving on, in verse 3, so he begins with calling on God in his distress. We know his distress. Verse 2, we find out, okay, someone has betrayed him. Verse 3, the human side of him comes out and he begins to lash out, and we see some crude words in verse 3. He says, what will he do to you, and what more besides, you deceitful tongue? He will punish you with a warrior's sharp arrows and with burning coals of a broom tree. I don't know about broom tree and coals. That sounds a bit crude to me. These are crude words. But what is he saying to us? What is the psalmist implying here? First and foremost, my dear friends, he is implying to us that God, you know all things. I know I'm lashing out, but you know. You see all things. You see when we are betrayed, when we are broken, when we are let down, when we are misunderstood, when we are misplaced and we are not included. You see all things, and you understand us more than we understand ourselves. But what I love about the disposition of the psalmist, I love his authenticity. I love how transparent he is. You know, sometimes when people let us down, when we are hurt, the first thing we want to do is to just start gossiping or lashing out of anger or just tell everybody about it. But the psalmist invites God into the situation. He realizes that he has moved off track from his spiritual pilgrimage. He has called upon the Lord, but he trusts that God will listen to him even when he has wandered off track. He invites God into the mess. And I love how honest he is. These words like burning coals and broom trees, I don't know what that is, sharp arrows, they're crude words. But he doesn't mince his words. He just wants to say exactly how his heart is feeling. And I remembered King David when I was reading this psalm, and I was thinking about how many pages in the book of Psalms is filled with David's pungent words as he lashes out when he's distressed or discouraged, despondent. Sometimes he even says, God, just get rid of them. Like, get rid of them. But what we love about David is the authenticity of his heart. We love how wonderful we love the intimacy with which he comes before God. We love the friendship that he has with God. No wonder he's known as a man after God's own heart. And so here the psalmist is lamenting before God in honest confession. And I think sometimes for us it's a good lesson because, I know for myself sometimes, we come before God with like a set of vocabulary. We have certain things that we come prepared to say before God. And we give God a version of what we think he needs to hear, rather than the version of what God desires to hear straight from our hearts. And I love how God doesn't want us to mince words. Even if it's crude, even if it's pungent words, God can take it because God desires the depth of our hearts. I also think about sometimes, in relationships, especially when the people that you love the most, the people that you trust the most, when they let you down, the most instant human reaction is to just lash out, gossip, slander, and then paint the town red, like tell everybody what they've done. But the psalmist tells us that it can be very tempting to do that. But when we do that, as much as people's opinions are valued, as much as the world may have some great solutions for us, sometimes it's very tempting to do that. But when we exclude God out of our distress, there is a huge risk for us to wander off track from the path that God has for us. And so the key is to remember who God is, that God can handle our mess, and God can be invited into any affliction that hurts us. The second word that I want to give you is the word recognition. So we go to verse 5. The psalmist says, "Woe to me that I dwell in Meshach, that I live among the tents of Kedar." Something amazing has happened here. We see there's a change in the spiritual trajectory of this pilgrimage. The psalmist begins in verse 1. He is in distress. We know someone has betrayed him, so there's an offender. He comes before God. He's human. He begins to lash out. But now, he's coming on to himself. He's taken on that inward journey. Woe is not my brother or sister. Woe is not my offender or my betrayer. Woe is me. The psalmist takes personal responsibility for his actions. And this is what he says to God in verse 5. He says, God, truth is, I intentionally wandered off to Meshach. I intentionally wandered off to live in tents of Kedar. Meshach and Kedar were Gentile territories. They were pagan nations having pagan practices and lifestyles. So for us today, it means any place where, faith can be threatened, where we can wander off from the path that God has for us with immoral practices and lifestyles. And so the psalmist remembers, he says, you know what, God, I know he betrayed me, but you know where it happened? It happened in those tents. I went there. And remember, I was saying that the Israelites were marked by covenant love. So their dwelling place was Jerusalem. That was where God had positioned them. Home was where God was, and God was in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a place where he had planted them. That is where they were meant to live and move, have their existence, flourish, and bear fruit. They were not meant to wander off to Meshach and Kedar, which is what the psalmist did, which is what we all do. I don't know, my dear friends, in your life right now, if there are places in your journey where you've wandered off track. Maybe you began well, and we all begin well. Somewhere in the course of the journey, we move away from our hearts, right? And we just get off course. Maybe there's parts of your heart right now, you're mourning in distress, but rather than taking them to God, you're looking for the validation of people. Maybe it is you there, you've been hurt, you've been betrayed. Maybe there's some really harsh words that have been said against you, and you're hurting. But rather than taking that to God, you are slandering this person or these people. You are gossiping about them, telling everybody about them, trying to fix the broken pieces of your life with your own strength. I'm reminded of these beautiful words by Saint Mother Teresa. She said, be the change you want to see in this world. Healing begins when we first take responsibility for our own sin, for our own actions. Change begins when I recognize, this is me, I've done this. Change begins when I recognize, woe is not my brother, not my sister, not my offender. Woe is me. It's me, it's me, it's me, oh Lord, standing in the need of prayer. The third word that I like to give you, and I bring it to a close, is the word reconciliation. I need to reconcile because I have wandered away from the heart of God. My dear friends, reconciliation is the most hardest part of this mountain climbing, this ascending to Jerusalem, so to say. Because at the heart of reconciliation is God waiting to make all things new. And that's very hard because the process of making all things new involves a process of crushing and breaking and tearing down and pruning and refining of hearts. And that's very, very difficult. We resist the tender shaping hands of the potter, shaping our lives through the adversities of life. I know I do that. It's so easy to just opt for a quick fix. We'd rather take those journeys downward rather than take on the laborious task of moving upwards because it's difficult. But how great it is, what a consolation it is, my dear friends, that God is so patient with us, that He's never done with us on these journeys. So whether it's the difficulties of mountain climbing or it's this laborious journey before us that is tedious and difficult and dangerous, we are assured of the Good Shepherd's presence with us. He never leaves our side. He promises to never leave us, never forsake us. He walks with us. In fact, even more, He walks ahead of us. He goes before us, before the fire and the flood, taking on those journeys where we cannot take them on ourselves. And there, my dear friends, on this upward journey, we recognize and we realize and we remember today that great journey that He undertook for us, that journey that we could never take on our own. 2,000 years ago, Jesus embarked ascended on that hill alone on a cross, taking on that journey, my dear friends, that journey we could never earn, that journey we could never qualify, that journey we could never take on our own strength. The journey that he undertook, trying to bridge that chasm that existed between us and God, showing us the extravagant love of God, reconciling us back to the Father, bringing us home. Bringing us home. And so if you're in a place today where you need some encouragement, maybe you've thought, you've wandered so far away that is it possible to come back? The answer is always yes, because God waits for us. God waits to bring us back home. One of my favorite parts of that song, the Song of Ascent, is the lyrics that go, wherever I am, wherever I find myself, your name can move mountains wherever I stand. And that is the truth of our lives. The truth of our lives is we don't walk these journeys alone. We walk these journeys with a good shepherd. He is a good, good shepherd, even as he's a good, good father. He walks with us, my dear friends. We are walking with a God who moves mountains for us. A God who's gone to great lengths to move the mountains in our lives. This is a God who speaks and mountains bow down and obey him. We're not alone on this journey. You are not alone on this journey. Don't begin tomorrow, my friends. Here and now, hear the beckoning of God calling you home. Begin today. Begin now. Come home. God bless.